Question. If a tree falls in the forest but no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, not according to George Berkeley. In fact, according to George Berkeley, in the absence of any kind of perception, there is no sound, nor tree, nor forest, nor anything. Now, let me pause right here and say up front that yes, I am aware that many may argue that the name should rightly be pronounced Barkley, but hell no. I'll be damned before I pronounce ER like AR. And plus, that's not how you pronounce the city of Berkeley, which is named after George Berkeley. So, yes, it's Berkeley, not Barkley. But anyway, George Berkeley, if you did not know, was a towering figure of Enlightenment era Western philosophy and probably the most prominent figure in the history of philosophical idealism. Now, I'm not sure whether it could be argued that Berkeley originally formulated the doctrine of idealism, but he is, I would say, probably the most consequential figure in that tradition. And this work, Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous, serves to expound upon his idealistic philosophy through a series of Socratic dialogues between two characters, Hylas and Philonous. Hylas is named after the Greek word for matter, which I believe is highly, and Philonous means lover of spirit, I believe. And it perhaps goes without saying that Philonous is Berkeley's mouthpiece character. Now, this is actually something of a reworking of a previous work of Berkeley's, which was a treatise concerning the principles of human understanding. That was the first work, I believe, in which he laid down his doctrine of idealism or immaterialism, if you will. And as probably could have been expected, it got some backlash and it got some counter arguments. And so he kind of reworked it into this Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous, which kind of restates the tenets and also provides arguments in defense of his position. So yeah, the contents of Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous argue for immaterialism, or extreme subjective idealism. Hylas is a materialist, or what you might say a naive realist, who takes the external world at face value and says that yes, there is an external world composed of matter, things outside of ourselves that it's composed of a substance apart from our perception of it. And Philonous is like, no, dog, that's wrong. He's like, no, nothing exists outside of the mind. Everything is mental, or I should say, everything is spiritual. And a lot of this is kind of pushing back against some of the work of John Locke, because in Locke's philosophy, he had made a distinction between primary and secondary qualities when it came to objects and articles and things. That an object's primary qualities are those things which it possesses independent of human perception, such as shape, size, stuff like that. Whereas secondary qualities are things that exist only in the human mind, such as color, scent, taste, the things that we pick up with our senses, right? But in this work, Berkeley is like, no, that's wrong. Or to be more specific, Locke didn't go far enough. He asserts that there is no distinction between primary and secondary qualities. All qualities, all properties that an object possesses are mental properties. They do not exist apart from the perception of them. And that's why, even though the phrase is not used in Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous, it is used, I believe, in a treatise concerning the principles of human understanding, and that phrase is esse est percipi. That is to be perceived. So this is, a position which kind of flies in the face of common sense, I think, and that has been, kind of the reception to it since its first, iteration, I suppose, is that that's some like crazy crap. But Berkeley makes some pretty good arguments in this. It's very powerfully reasoned, and one of the major, and in fact probably the most immediate counter argument that can be made against this position is kind of like in Albert Einstein's statement that I like to think that the moon is still there even when I'm not looking at it. By that is to be meant that how can you honestly aver that things do not exist unless they are perceived? Like, if you leave a room, do the objects in that room, in the absence of your perceiving them, do they cease to exist? And Berkeley says no, they do not, because they are still perceived by something, and that something would be God. And this is a pretty interesting argument for the existence of God, because Philonous in the book essentially says that things continue to persist because the all-seeing eye continues to perceive them always, and that's what holds everything in existence. And that when you get right down to it, we and everything are really only ideas in the mind of God. Now, this is something of an inversion of Spinoza's philosophy, because Spinoza was a materialist, and he was also kind of a pantheist in the sense that he argued that God is the material universe, that there is no distinction between God and all that exists, that God is all that exists. But Berkeley is here arguing that all that exists only as a collection of ideas in the mind of God. And like I say, it's pretty interesting argument for the existence of God, but it is perfectly logical. You can see the necessity for that in this system of thought. You definitely can. And then the final dialogue in this is dedicated to kind of arguments attempting to rebut the arguments made against Berkeley's positions. And on the note of Berkeley's argument for the existence of God, I would say that the position that he takes as regards the nature of God leaves some weak spots, because if he had been arguing for God in like an abstract deistic sense, I don't think there would have been a problem. But given that Berkeley was a bishop, he was a clergyman, and therefore very passionately Christian, he instead argues for God in the like traditional theistic, specifically Christian sense of that word. And Hylas perhaps predictably counter argues that, like, if you're going to argue that, then that means that all the bad shit in the world, like murder and rape and torture and like, all these evil things, are also ideas of God's. And Berkeley, he makes some counter arguments to that, but I'm not sure that they're 100% bulletproof. I think that particular stance kind of leaves him open in some ways. But overall, that's kind of the gist of the work, that matter does not exist, only spirit exists. Nothing exists that is not perceived. We're all just ideas in the mind of God. Pretty outre claims, I think, both then and now. And what's interesting about three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous is that you can see the argument. You can see it all laid out pretty well. You can follow the logic of it. And again, the arguments are pretty robust. And yet, even though you can clearly follow his line of reasoning, and you can see that they're, if you look at things the way that he looks at them, you can see the sense in what he's saying. And yet, I think the majority of people, even if they can understand the argument, I think they will probably be very reluctant to accept the argument because, once more, it kind of just flies in the face of common sense. And again, I think that was the reception, more or less, to the book when it was to Berkeley's work when he first published it, is that people were like, "What the hell are you smoking?" But he argues it very well, very forcefully, and again, I guess ultimately it does just come down kind of to a matter of perspective, or perhaps so. But again, I think most people will be very reluctant to embrace this position because of just how insane it sounds. But it does make a lot of sense internally. And once more, I guess maybe it does just kind of come down to a matter of perspective. Now, the reason why I undertook to read this is because, one, the notion of idealism does kind of fascinate me, because even though it does, once more, fly in the face of common sense and sound very outlandish, it is fascinating. It really is. And you can kind of, I feel like a lot of people, if they just sit down and like think about it enough and think about the significance of their own perception and, you know, all that it entails, I think you can kind of reason your way to some rudimentary idealism yourself. Again, referring back to the old, if a tree falls in the forest but no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound question. Again, that question is kind of, that really does kind of, that kind of represents, I think, a layman's formulation of the query, which lies at the heart of the idealistic position. But another reason why I undertook to read this is because in Cormac McCarthy's final book, Stella Maris, there is quite a bit of discussion devoted to Berkeley, and Cormac McCarthy was absolutely something of an idealist, and in retrospect, you can definitely see that influence pretty much throughout his body of work. Like in Blood Meridian, the judge asks the kid some questions there towards the end of the book, which lend themselves to kind of an idealistic position. And also in The Crossing, there is that line which reads, "Acts have their being in the witness." Again, that's just explicitly Berkeleyan in its sensibilities. But so I just kind of wanted to read this because Berkeley had such an influence on the novel Stella Maris, and again, kind of in a broader sense, just to the entire corpus of Cormac McCarthy's work. And I'm really glad that I read this. Again, I don't know that I would subscribe to this view, but I gotta tip my hat. He had a position which he had to have known was going to be, something that a lot of people were going to push back against, but he laid it out and argued for it passionately and with a lot of logical force, and I can respect that. So I don't rate books like this, but I will say that I am glad that I read 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, and if nothing else, it will give you, food for thought. It'll give you something to think about. So yes, 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. Have you read this work? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it, and also whether or not you agree or disagree with the position of immaterialism, or like extreme subjective idealism, whether or not you believe or do not believe that nothing exists but what is perceived. And if you haven't read this, you might want to pick this up. It's very short. It won't take you very long to read, but it'll give you something to chew on, definitely. So you might want to pick it up if you're interested in this kind of thing. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.